the Populist some more, but more specifically, I'm going to talk about what's known by some historians as the Southern Populist Challenge. And actually, not all historians would really know about this. Okay, so this is something that you're not going to find in your textbook. It's just one what some historians have argued in the past. It's not something. It's, I would say, sort of semi-obscure, but it's interesting nonetheless. And what was the Southern Populist Challenge? Well, what Southern populists, or just populists in general, wanted to do, all right, was to get involved politically. And when you start getting involved politically, what you try to do is you try to create coalitions. And in the South, what you had a lot of were poor people. Okay, probably most of our um, uh, I guess ancestors or relatives in the you know 1880s, whether regardless of where you're from, probably most of them were poor. My people were poor, but then I started making the big dollars when I started teaching history. Actually, this is not true, but anyway, that's besides the point. Okay, so um, you had in the South poor whites, and you had, of course, poor African Americans, many of whom were former slaves. Not all right, but most. I mean, there were exceptions, especially actually in the New Orleans area. And of course, you had a lot of poor whites. The majority of whites in the South were poor. Okay, so if somehow you could get these two groups together, all right, then you could form a very strong coalition. And they could vote as a block, okay, block vote. And they would vote for populist. Now, why were they not unified at this time? Well, of course, you had racism, but let's not get into that too much right now. Let's look at well, whites at that time in the South mainly voted for Democrats. Blacks in the South at that time voted mainly, all right, for Republicans. Now, of course, today it is reversed. Okay, this all started in the 1960s, where many African Americans, once they were able to vote in the South, and we'll get into how they were politically disenfranchised in the next lecture, if not this one. Well, they when they registered, for the most part, voted Republican. There are still some exceptions here and there in where African Americans. Uh, I think I made a mistake there. Actually, they voted. When they in the 1960s, many African Americans started registering to be Democrats. Okay, so I may have said Republicans. I have to look at it again, but let's make sure you get that straight. Sometimes it's good when I make these mistakes, and that's what the students remember the most. All right, so that's good. So many African Americans started voting or registering as a Democrat. Let me make this clear. Okay, so let's say in the 1880s, whites were voting for Democrats, blacks were voting Republican. Now, so they did not vote together, but populists said, look, if they could vote together, they could form a coalition, and they could kick out the people that had been in power for a long time. Or that would actually, I shouldn't say that, that's actually not the case. They weren't in power for a long time, but they would be in power for a long time. But at that time, we were talking about the political and economic elite, or the Bourbon Democrats. Now, this is actually a French word. In French, you would say Bourbon. So it's just like Bourbon Street in New Orleans. I'm sure. I don't know if y'all have been there. I'm sure a lot of you have been there. So this goes back to like King Louis the 14th, the 15th, the 16th. If they had, if their last name was Bourbon, okay, so it's an old monarchy. It's an old name of the monarchs in France. And so these Bourbon Democrats in the South, pretty much, and especially in Louisiana, had control. That's when you get, later on uh, in the 20s, you had people like Huey Long, and then later on his brother, Uncle Earl. Y'all probably heard stories about those guys. They came around and they challenged the Bourbon Democrats, all right, and their hold on power. Well, obviously the Bourbon Democrats, all right, obviously the Bourbon Democrats did not want this to happen. Okay, they felt challenged, they felt threatened, all right, by these populists and what they wanted to do. Okay, again, they wanted to bring whites and African Americans together to vote in a bloc. So the Bourbons, or the Bourbon, the wealthy Southern Democrats, responded to this threat, to their dominance, by attempting to divide whites and blacks through appeals to racial fear. And they succeeded. And for the first time since the end of the Civil War, they were able to disenfranchise and completely segregate African Americans. Now, there were some states that started this earlier, like Mississippi, okay, that really started all of this segregation at the end of Reconstruction, all right, with the election of Hayes. But most started in the late 1880s and early 1890s. Okay, so two things happened. All right, basically, what we're going to see is we call de jure segregation. Okay, de jure segregation. De jure means by law. Now, this is different than de facto segregation, which means by tradition, custom, something like that. Okay. In other words, if you go somewhere, you travel, and there happens to be people from Louisiana or from Southwest Louisiana or from Lake Charles or whatever, you tend to congregate around the people that you're most like, okay, and that you have things in common, and so you segregate yourself. So this is what we call de facto segregation. But de jure segregation is something very different. This is also called what some people call American apartheid, okay? Or just apartheid, but in this case, American apartheid. Now, we're going to talk about that in a little bit, but before we get into de jure segregation, I'm going to discuss a few things concerning how the Bourbon Democrats, how the people in the establishment, the economic and political elite, all right, were able to politically, right, disenfranchise African Americans. Okay, so in other words, this is basically taking their right to vote away. Okay, now if you recall, during Reconstruction, there were three very important amendments that were passed in the Constitution: the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, and the 15th Amendment. The 13th Amendment, all right, ended slavery. Fourteenth Amendment gave former slaves citizenship, African American citizenship. Not all African Americans in the country were slaves, but this was mainly intended for those people. But basically stated that citizenship could not be denied, especially if you were, you know, to those former slaves and African Americans. And there's a lot more to the 14th Amendment than that. But for these purposes, that's what you need to know. And the 15th Amendment basically also gave the right to vote to African Americans if they were of the right gender and age. In other words, still females were not allowed to vote. That would come later with the 19th Amendment. Okay? So how were they, and I say they, I'm talking about the Bourbon Democrats, how were they able to circumvent the 15th Amendment? So you have the 15th Amendment, and they had to kind of get around or circumvent the 15th Amendment in order to politically disenfranchise African Americans. All right, to the point to where you had very few, all right, African Americans in the South, all right, that could vote after they did this. So in 1920, for example, there were very few African Americans that could vote in Louisiana. And of course, this is really a big part of what the civil rights movement was really about. Okay, it was giving African Americans the right to vote. I mean, people died for this right. Well, what did they do? Okay, first thing, this is no particular order. They used threats and violence. This is where you got a lot of the KKK activity. At this point, actually, the KKK was real big during Reconstruction when many whites were politically disenfranchised, and then it kind of goes down a little bit, but then it comes up again in the late 19 teens and in the 1920s, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on. But they never completely went away. Okay. Sometimes people would that wanted to scare off blacks at the polling stations they would get drunk and they would go there, and when an African American family came up for the man to vote, all right, this person would kind of go crazy and start firing his guns in the air and just go nuts. Okay, so yeah, that would scare anybody. Then they started passing literacy tests. And basically, they would make the literacy tests very easy for whites and very hard, all right, for blacks. All right. And so if you were a white person and you went there, then basically they would say, okay, what's the Constitution mean to you? And then you just say, well, it means, the right to bear arms, or it means the right to, freedom, or whatever. You could say almost anything, and then you would get a go. If you were African American, they'd give you a super hard test, and they would give you a no-go. Okay, so this was a tactic that they used to circumvent the 15th Amendment. Okay, that was used well into the 1950s and early 1960s. Third, they instituted poll taxes. All right. Basically, you had to pay. Now, fourth, since the poll tax might disenfranchise poor whites as well. Now, this is very important. They instituted what they called the grandfather clause. Okay. Now, what the grandfather clause stated was that it allowed people that couldn't pay the taxes, or even people that were not literate, to vote if their fathers or grandfathers had been able to vote, right, on January 1st, 1867. Now, in 1867, January 1st, 1867, all right, this is before radical Reconstruction, all right. Well, African Americans could not vote. And so if you were white, you said, well, yeah, my grandfather could vote at that time, so therefore I don't have to pay the poll tax. And oftentimes they wouldn't even make them take the literacy test. Now, something else that they did, the Bourbon Democrats, was they started what's known as white primaries. Okay, white primaries. Well, basically, what this meant was that the Democratic Party in the South did not allow anyone, unless they were white, to be in the Democratic Party. And so as a result, when you had a primary in the South, since whites were the majority of the people, so let's say if you have 70%, that's white, they were almost all, the vast majority of the 70% were Democrats, and so Republicans had really no chance to get elected. Then the primary basically became the general election, because very few Republicans would even run. And since the primary was the general election, all right, and since only whites, so you had a Democrat, let's say his name is Bill, you have another Democrat and his name is James, and only whites, all right, could vote, then essentially no Republicans are running. Okay, the Republicans are not; they haven't fielded any candidates. All right, then like I said, the primary would become basically the general election, and if Bill won, then he would he would have if he won the primary, then he would win the whole election. Okay, so this is known as white primaries. Basically, what you need to remember about that is that Democrats would not allow blacks to join their party. I mean, it was looked at as a kind of a private organization, and so therefore they could kind of do what they wanted to do in terms of that. And since very few, hardly any Republicans would ever run, you would just have a primary, and since you had just the primary, and whoever won the primary won the election, then essentially, if there wasn't not a Republican running, African Americans couldn't vote in this primary because the Democrats wouldn't allow them into um, to join. Okay, so these are methods of politically disenfranchising. Sometimes you'll see this spelt without the E. Actually without the N too, disfranchising or disfranchisement. But I like to disenfranchise. I like to use that. Um, so of African Americans, right? Now in the next lecture we're going to talk about what I said earlier, de jure segregation, which lasted uh, really into the 1960s, even though you had Brown versus Board of Education in the 50s, but that we'll talk about that later.